we did get some feedback on some levels that basically people were rage quitting, and so we were like, okay, well, we'll take that into account, and
Yeah,
we'll fix that.
maybe we change that.
I am joined today by Adam Frye and Chris Perry of Midnight Mastodon, and we are going to be talking about their game Rocket Core, which is currently on Steam Greenlight. Thank you both for agreeing to talk to us a little bit about your game and your history.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate it.
Yeah. So to begin, for people that aren't aware of Rocket Core, why don't you give us a pitch for the game? Tell us what it is and why people should be pumped about it.
So Rocket Core is it's in the style of an old NES game, kind of like an old 8-bit action platformer with an emphasis on you have a jetpack. That's sort of like one of the main gameplay elements, and you sort of use that to either bypass or get around the various obstacles and enemies that are in the game that intend to do you a great deal of harm. There are treasures to collect throughout each stage. It's just like a one-screen level, and once you've collected all the treasures, the exit appears, and you can proceed to the next level. And that goes on and on and on for 100 levels.
Nice.
And we introduce new tricks and traps pretty much like every 10 levels. And so the game will always feel kind of fresh and hopefully not repetitive, like maybe some of the old NES games did back then, to kind of conserve memory and what have you. So the intent really is just to keep the player wanting to get to the next section of levels so they can see what new gameplay elements are being introduced as far as like the traps go, and we do some stuff with like the physics and things like that and introducing enemies. So yeah, that's sort of the short of it.
Perfect. So you touched on the thing that's kind of at the core of Rocket Core, and that's nostalgia. And anybody that checks out the demo that's available, which there'll be a link to in the comments below on, will immediately feel nostalgic if they played any of those old NES games. What was the drive to create a game of that type, of that level of nostalgia?
So I mean, Adam and I, we growing up, we grew up playing the NES and Super NES. Games like Contra and Double Dragon. I personally, I love Commander Keen. That was an old inspiration for me. And so when we teamed up on this, this started as a game jam game where we tried to go really lo-fi. We did the game in a CGA palette just as like a throwback to our early childhood. And we just thought it would be fun to do that. And when we were done with it, done with the game jam, we were like, hey, this is actually pretty fun. I wonder how we could expand on it. And so yeah, we decided to go with a slightly modified NES palette, and to go, yeah, just kind of that old school gameplay. I would maybe compare the level layout and design kind of like Bubble Bobble in a way, mixed with Super Meat Boy.
And actually, Chris and I also are fans of the old Apple II Conan game.
Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yep.
Where it's just one screen basically, and you can see where you start and you see where you end, and you're just like, okay, there are some weird, interesting things going on here. Like I got to jump in a bubble and things like that. And so how do I get to that point successfully? I think we both kind of wanted to secretly emulate that as well, in the level design, which is, I think, really what we're driving for is how does the player go from point A to point B to point C and point D without dying and still collecting all the treasures and trying to kill as many enemies as they can and get to the exit as quickly as possible. There's sort of that element of, how quickly can I beat this while still doing everything that I need to do in each.
Yeah.
Cool. What were some of the challenges that you ran into in making a game of this style?
Gosh, I think the biggest challenge for me has been with the palette limitations that we went with. I'm used to really having an unlimited palette to work with, and so sticking with just it's basically an NES palette with a few colors modified, and so sticking with that palette has been hard for me. And then in addition to that, designing levels. I mean, because our goal is 100 levels, so designing levels in a way that it's not 100 levels of the same basic thing. It's like how do I keep coming up with like fresh ideas
Sure.
and mixing it up with levels that have a defined path that you must follow versus levels that are more free flowing and you can go from multiple angles. Just trying to keep it. Keep the variety up so that people don't get burned out. We did get some feedback on some levels that basically people were rage quitting, and so we were like, okay, well, we'll take that into account and we'll fix that.
maybe we change that. So that's also another thing because we're playing these levels over and over and over again, and so maybe we're a little more used to the physics, whereas somebody new coming into this, especially with the beta, we needed to try and make it a little bit more fair for folks who maybe aren't used to playing this type of game.
Sure.
Or maybe the difficulty is a bit too extreme, even for people who are used to that level of difficulty.
Great. That segues really nicely into kind of the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is how you kind of process feedback from people and how this has worked into the process of going on Steam Greenlight, and what that process has been like for you, and how you guys approached that preparing for that move.
So we've been really lucky to form some good relationships with folks on Facebook, some other indie developers, YouTube, like Let's Play type people, some speedrunning folks, and they've given us some really, really awesome feedback that it was very tangible and solid feedback that we could use to improve on the game. We had originally, in order to prep for Greenlight, we formed a lot of good relationships. We sent out a kind of a YouTube, Twitch, Let's Play user group, a beta for them specifically to play and make any videos about. And so we got some good feedback from that. I don't know, we posted and submitted to some various game dev forums and said, hey, this is out there, vote yes for us, obviously, but also check out these videos, give us some feedback. And I think it was maybe a week after getting onto Greenlight, we released the public demo. And that's been, I think that's been really successful so far. A lot of good feedback that we've been able to use to improve the level design. And like what Adam was saying, it's like, we've become pros at our own levels that we've created and played 100 times. So to get that outside feedback or watch videos of people playing it and commenting on it, it's been really cool and really, honestly, really rewarding to see that.
Cool. So moving away from Rocket Core specifically, I'd like to talk a little bit about your background. And you kind of already mentioned a little bit of the background of Rocket Core, how it started as a game jam. But what was it that brought each of you to the world of independent game design?
I think for me, in the last couple of years, independent game design has become, just game design in general, I think has become more accessible to folks who grew up playing video games and always wanted to get into it. But, back in the 80s and in 90s, I think there was maybe more of a steeper learning curve because of the resources that were available and the type of programming languages that, these developers used. And, they were pretty challenging, especially for somebody like me. And so, but today you have a lot of tools that are available to you and a lot of really great tutorials and just useful information that can really kind of walk you through the basics to get you started. And so for me, just in the last couple of years, I saw this as more of an obtainable goal. As someone who's always wanted to get into it, maybe not ever work for like a giant publisher like EA or Ubisoft or somebody like that, but just sort of do my own thing or work with Chris and do our own thing, and not feel the limitations that maybe a larger publisher would put on us. And being able to have that freedom makes the whole process a lot easier, I think. And so, for me, it's just always been that, just to kind of summarize, it's always just been that dream to get into game development. And nowadays it seems like it's a little bit easier, at least to kind of get your feet wet and to see where that goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, I, from a young age, playing NES games, it was just one of those things where I was like, man, I wish I could make a game like this. And my parents were super supportive of me being curious about computers. And so I think it was, man, I must have been like 9 or 10 when I bought the Pi 3D game creation system. And it was this super rudimentary 3D game engine, but it let you make first-person shooters for DOS. They were somewhere between Wolfenstein and like the previous generation of like EGA FPSs.
Yeah.
And so the games were terrible, but it was one of those things where it's like, hey, this is kind of a creative outlet, and this is fun. And so I've kind of pursued it in various ways since then. And I think I've been actively making games probably since like, I don't know, the mid 90s when I was like 12 or so. And then Adam and I both work in separate areas, but at the same company. And we were IMing one day and just talking about game design, a project that I was working on for fun. And I was like, hey, man, you have a lot of, game playing experience and ideas and understanding of game mechanics. We should team up and try and make something. And so that's kind of how, that was about a year ago. That's kind of how we started out doing this as a pair.
Cool. You mentioned some of the games that inspired Rocket Core, but were there any games that really were, for you, a moment that this was the game that inspired you to make games? You talked a little bit about this, Chris, but or both in the past, like growing up, nostalgia, which obviously Rocket Core is very thick with, but also kind of more currently, were there any games that really ignited that spark of creativity that you played that got the gears rolling, so to speak?
I think for me, kind of the turning point when I was like, I should probably get more serious about this, was when I played Cave Story. That game blew my mind, and the more that I learned about it, where it was everything about the game was made by one single guy, and how deep the story was, how for the time amazing the graphics were for an independent designer who tackled everything about the game. I know Rocket Core came out like 13, 14 years ago, but did I say Rocket Core? Cave Story, I'm sorry. When that came out, I guess I wouldn't even consider that really a modern game anymore because it's been out for so long, but I think that's the one I can point to where it's just like, oh my gosh, everything changed for me.
I think for me, the first time I played Super Mario Brothers, I grew up with Atari 2600 initially, and that was great, but you really had to use your imagination.
Yeah.
With Super Mario Brothers, I think worlds were a lot more realized, and that blew my mind. And when I got into PC gaming, it was right around when like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom were really popular, and they had some really easy to use, amazing level editors, and I got really into that, and I think that's really what started to kind of spark my interest in like level design and things like that. Watching friends and other folks that I knew online play Doom death matches in levels that I had created and have a lot of fun with it. It really kind of inspired me. I think today, games like La Mulana, where you have that old school, I mean, that's a game where there's just love poured into that for the old MSX and its history and Maze of Gallias, but also current games like Dark Souls and where it's just, we're not going to hold your hand. We're just going to kind of throw you in there. We'll give you a few pieces of advice, but please just go and explore and do some trial and error and figure it out. And it's just stuff like that where you're kind of given this opportunity to just go and explore and figure things out on your own without having a lot of tutorials and hints and clues and things like that. That really just, those types of games I think really inspire me on the game development side. It really just kind of opens your mind, I guess. That's
Sure.
I see it.
Awesome. To bring things to a close, we always like to ask developers we talk to what other games that are out there now that are being in development or have recently been completed or are right on the horizon are really capturing their attention. If there are indie games out there, indie dev teams that they think are really innovative, we always like to hear which ones those are. So please share what is capturing your attention on the market now.
I think for me, and I'm actually not sure. I think this came out maybe last year. I actually really love the game Plug by Carpet Bones. It's PLLUG. It's not a long game, but it's just a lot of fun. It's like a 2-color palette. It's just sort of a platformer-y, puzzly type of game. You're a plug basically, and you need to get from one place to another, and you plug yourself into these light sources to help kind of brighten the area up to make it easier to see where you're going and things like that. And it's just it's got kind of that retro look to it, and it's just a lot of fun. I really just enjoyed it.
Awesome.
Quite a bit.
For me, 2 groups come to mind. Voyager Games is working on this, and I know you're familiar with them.
Yeah, very.
Sam's working on Outer Colony. That game looks so incredible, and it's amazing the depth that he's been able to put into that as a pretty much a one-man team. And so I'm really excited to see what comes of that. And then the other one is this guy Sinclair Strange. He's done a number of kind of old school NES style action platformers. But man, he's working on this like cyberpunk, old school looking FPS right now, and it just looks incredible. And I haven't been so excited to see a game come out in so long, so I cannot wait for him to finish that up.
Awesome. Well, Adam and Chris of Midnight Mastodon, thank you so much for talking to us about Rocket Core, about the background of it, and about your story as indie developers. There will be links below to the Steam Greenlight page for Rocket Core, so check that out. And if you like what you see, please toss them a vote. And there'll be more information on them as well.
Thanks,
Thank
Jacob.
you. Really appreciate it.